I knew one survivor who passed away before they found the ship, and the subject wasn't as big a deal. And basically, as her family went through her things and threw them out, I got to go through the trash later, literally, and found like a handwritten account of the sinking, her diary that she started after the disaster, describing it starts when she arrived in New York on the Carpathia, a list of her losses that she had kept, and even a White Star pin. It wasn't on the Titanic, I'm sure. She would have said so. But from that era, just a little White Star line ship's wheel pin that you'd wear on your lapel or something. And so, I've gotten things like that over the years, but I don't actually buy things. I don't go to auctions or anything like that.
Hello, this is Alexandra Boyd. 2024 sees the release of my independent documentary, Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries. On June 17th, it will screen in cities across Canada, and I'll be at the screening in Vancouver, BC for a Q&A. Book your tickets before June the 6th to ensure your screening goes ahead. Ticket links are on our website, shipofdreamsfilm.com. Be sure to subscribe there for the announcements for special event screenings in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom and Ireland. Secure your ticket now for a peek behind the scenes of James Cameron's Titanic. Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, and everything to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic, groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Actors, historians, authors, descendants and fans come here to talk about Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Nelson Aspen, and you're in for a real treat today on this podcast of Titanic Talk. Our guest today is a legend within the Titanic community, and we all owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. He has the distinction of probably being the foremost historian and beloved living link to all things Titanic. We wouldn't have, we probably wouldn't be enjoying all the things that we can enjoy about Titanic's legacy without him. He is a legend, and I will leave it to his Titanic co-star, Alexandra Boyd, to do the introductions.
Thank you, Nelson. Well, I have to say that my link to Don Lynch, because by now everybody's guessed who you're talking about, is because when you helped me, you assisted me in my audition and my research for my part on Titanic for James Cameron. The most useful and wonderful book that you lent me was Titanic, an illustrated history by Don Lynch and Ken Marshall. And I was absolutely drawn to it. And when I first stepped on the set in the first class dining room, James Cameron had this book, this dog-eared book with the spine all bent and the cover pulled off and pieces ripped out. And it was Don's book. And now we have him on our podcast 26 years later, 27, 28. I'm losing count now of how we're still talking about this ship and this film. And you, Don, welcome to Titanic Talk.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite an introduction. But yeah, I think it's been 28 years since they started filming. So it's amazing how time has gone by.
Time has gone by, but somehow it stays in our memory. And the young people that we've learned who have been completely swept up in this story. But I still have to underscore that the thread goes back to that first book, because Jim was trying to find you, right?
That's my understanding, yes, that Ken Marshall actually called his production office, and when he heard about the movie, and he said, Don Lynch and I live in the LA area. We'd be interested in helping. And the person he spoke with said, we've been trying to find you. And so that got us involved.
It is amazing. Don, you were a guest on our anniversary podcast back in April. We only got to speak with you very briefly, but I recounted that when I was very young, I had an album in the days of vinyl, and the album was about the Titanic, and I would play it and play it and play it. But you had either written the liner notes or you were a commentator there. Then, of course, I had your books, and when you released Ghost of the Abyss, I hosted the book signing at a Borders in West Hollywood with you and Ken and James, and that was. I was starstruck by you. So all of us in the Titanic community look to you as a hero, as a leader, and in many ways kind of a patriarch. What was it about Titanic? What was your spark that initiated your interest?
Well, I think it's something you're born with. I think there's a little piece of your brain that says Titanic. I think I was, like many children, I was probably interested in it. I remember seeing the movie from 1953 on television when I was young and was fascinated. But then I also remember that Monday on school, everybody kept saying, "Did you see Titanic on Saturday?" And all the kids had seen it and thought it was great. But it was actually 1973 after I saw the Poseidon Adventure and enjoyed the movie and had to find out what real shipwrecks were about. I was more into nonfiction. And so, I had to, take a few books out of the library. One of them was A Night to Remember by Walter Lord about the Titanic. And that one just grabbed me. And after that, I read it and then I turned around and read it again and joined the Titanic Historical Society, started doing research, and it just snowballed from there.
One of the happiest Titanic marriages, probably rivaling that of Ida and Isidore Straus, would be the union of you and Ken Marshall. I mean, you have generated such incredible content for all of us. James Cameron wouldn't have made the movie he made without you. Tell us how you and Ken came to be colleagues.
Well, marriage is a strong word. We're not that close.
A creative marriage.
Husbands.
But we've been friends for... Oh gosh, it's going close to 50 years. I was living in the Northwest and I came down to California to visit, and I was corresponding with a lady who had written a book about the Titanic, about psychic things, the Titanic, the psychic, and the sea. And she suggested I get together with Ken, and so I met him then. And then met him, several times after that. I think I visited California again, met him at a Titanic Historical Society convention in '77. And when I moved to California, we just became very good friends. And so it worked really well for working together on the book, since I was at that time the historian for the Titanic Historical Society. And I probably was going to write a book of my own anyway. And so him doing the artwork and me the illustrations, say, because he did a lot of the visuals, and then my doing the text, and it worked really well together.
That's what I was going to ask. What came first, the chicken or the egg? The illustrations, which needed the history, or the history, which needed the illustrations? But it sounded like it just was a wonderfully organic coming together of two creatives and two people very passionate about that story.
Well, Ken had been painting the Titanic for a long, long time before I ever met him. And so he had done a lot of the research about what the ship looked like. But we did collaborate a little bit because he would say, well, Don, okay, if I have the ship sinking this far, which lifeboats would be already gone? That sort of thing. And so, I was able to work with him on some of that. But, most of the artwork, he had done the research completely himself. And so I was more the story person. And that's kind of how it worked on the movie. He was the visual historian. I was more about what happened.
Talk a little bit about that, about your participation, because of course you handed over all of your books and everything you knew about Titanic to James Cameron, but you were there the whole time as well. What was that experience like? And you played the part that everybody knows. So to talk about that a bit.
Okay, well, I wasn't down on the movie set all the time. I did have a day job, but I went as often as I could, and I tried to be there for sort of each section of filming, and could basically go wherever I wanted. The first time I visited the set, Jim just said, you can go anywhere you want. He said, wow. Just don't stand under a crane or in front of a moving vehicle. And
or a camera that's rolling.
Yeah, well, that too. But, a lot of times being down there when they weren't filming, could just wander all over the sets, which was fantastic. And so, did that. But I had talked to Mally Finn, the casting director, about a possible cameo because, well, what the hell, if I'm going to work on a movie, I should have my face in there somewhere. And it had been done by other people in other movies, we know. And so she said, I said, well, can I have a cameo? And she said, can you row? And I said, well, like a sailor, I've never rowed, but I certainly never rowed a lifeboat. But in the end, it came down to the fact they never knew. I think the plan was, we were told, to have Ken and me in the smoking room scene, just in the background playing cards. And what it came down to was that, as you know, filming depended upon the weather. If the weather was good, they filmed outdoor scenes. If it was bad, they filmed indoor scenes. So they didn't know from day to day whether they'd be filming the smoking room scene or not. And so there was no planning ahead. And we were finally just told, you just need to come down and plant yourself here for a week. And Ken was working on something else and couldn't take an entire week of time, but I could. It was Thanksgiving week, so I didn't have to take too many days off of work. And then Ed and Karen Commuta, Ed being the founder of the Titanic Historical Society, flew out, and so they got to be in it as well. But the very first day we were there, got suited up, was handed this outfit, put it on, had to have someone help me with the tie and everything. And then,
what did that feel like when you saw yourself in the mirror?
Well, it's once you got up on the ship and everybody else is dressed like that, it feels normal. Mm-hmm. When everybody is dressed in period clothing, you're in that period mentally. You just dressed like everyone else. I mean, it's like styles, it's like if we suddenly looked at what we wore 30 years ago, we'd laugh. And yet at the time, it seemed perfectly fine. And that's how it was, because everybody else was dressed the same. And so, but I hadn't been dressed, I don't think, 10 minutes. And they said, go stand next to that little boy. And I did. And they said, you look like you could be his father. Get up on deck. And sent us up there. And so Jim was genuinely surprised to see me show up. And so, I got to be Frederick Spedden, the father of the little boy spinning the top, who was
such an iconic photo.
It is. It's based on this Father Brown photo taken by Francis Brown when he sailed on the ship as far as Ireland. And Jim had worked that photo into the film, into the script. Of course, he has it happening later in the voyage, but who's to say the little boy didn't play with his top more than once? But it was really nice for me because, I knew who this person was. I got to play a real person, actually knew the family. So it was just exciting for me to be in that role. And it wasn't by design. It just happened. And that was fantastic.
Alexandra and I, because we had, obviously we were so invested in James Cameron's film that when Ghost of the Abyss came out, she and I, we were both living in Los Angeles at the time. We went out to Universal City to a multiplex to see Ghost of the Abyss, and we're looking around trying to see, did you make it? And she's the only person from James Cameron's film that footage is in Ghost of the Abyss, and we're all excited. Yeah, call SAG, you're going to get a royalty check. But you have an even more significant role in Ghost of the Abyss.
Well, I do, and that was fine because, I'd had my cameo in Titanic, and so I didn't need to do that again. I always thought if you're in one great movie, hang up your hat, you're done. And so, but, as I said, Ken didn't get a chance to be in Titanic. So when Jim was working on Ghost of the Abyss, Ken did ask him, can I be Bruce Ismay? I feel like I look enough like him. And Jim said, of course. And then he turned to me and said, will you be Thomas Andrews? And it's like, well, when James Cameron asks you to be in a movie, you don't say no.
Well, you have to play Thomas Andrews. You double don't say no.
Well, exactly. Yeah. No, I've also been against someone who's was a real person, and so that worked out really well. I enjoyed that very much. We actually were filmed with speaking lines, but they ended up making the ghosts all silent, and so I never had to go back and do the looping, as they call it, putting the lines in later or anything like that. But I was wearing Victor Garber's suit. They brought clothing from the movie Titanic, because that was what Fox had in its department for 1912 clothing. And I wear the same suit that Victor Garber wore in a lot of Titanic. So that was kind of fun. At that time, I was the same size. Where that suit is now.
I don't know if it got sold in the Hollywood Hall last month. You remember they've recently sold. Planet Hollywood had a whole bunch of Titanic props, and some of them went for extraordinary numbers.
Well, this one had been worn a lot, and had the seat of it had, had a lot of wear, and I did manage to split it wide open, and it had been torn before, and I was amazed at the costuming person. I can't remember her name, but I just went to her and was telling her what a great job she was doing and how fantastic, and she finally said, "What did you do?" And and she fixed it. But after that, between scenes, I just took off the pants and I just wore jeans. And then, when it came time to film, I'd, dart into a corner and change my pants real quick because I wasn't going to tear those again. That just, I couldn't do that. But they had been torn multiple times. It really was a 1912 suit, I think.
Well, and we've learned that these costumes get reused and reused often. My costume that I wear in First Class Dining Room, Kate Winslet wore in her screen test, and she clocked it when she saw me. She's like, I wore that dress. And also, the people who really know are Titaniacs who know every frame of the movie, also watch other period films and spot the clothes that are, like, as you said, they're in the Fox archive in their wardrobe department, and they just go back on the hanger to be hired out again as they're needed to. But some of them sneak out and get collected by the collectors.
And I think because when I got my suit, it just specifically said Victor Garber, as I recall. But I remember they brought down other outfits, and they were like an actual ensemble on a hanger under plastic. And it had, a sheet of paper in there that not only told that it was in Titanic, but who wore it.
Yes.
And so, they knew. They really did know. Yeah.
Well, Don, no one would have access to more artifacts, memorabilia, props, what have you, than yourself. Are you a collector? What are the important mementos or treasures of yours as it relates to Titanic?
Well, I don't, I'm not a collector, no. So I do have a few things that are peripheral to the Titanic, you might say. One of my stories is I knew one survivor who passed away before they found the ship, and the subject wasn't as big a deal. And basically, as her family went through her things and threw them out, I got to go through the trash later, literally, and, found like a handwritten account of the sinking, her diary that she started after the disaster, describing, starts when she arrived in New York on the Carpathia, a list of her losses that she had kept, and even a White Star pin. Well, it wasn't on the Titanic, I'm sure. She would have said so. But even from that era, just a little White Star line ship's wheel pin that you'd wear on your lapel or something. And so, I've gotten things like that over the years, but I don't actually buy things. I don't go to auctions or anything like that. And then from the movie, a good friend of mine, Tom Nikolai Vargas, was working in the model shop. And so he gave me some pieces of the lead hull and things like that. But I really haven't kept much. I haven't really kept a collection from either the real Titanic or from the movie.
What's your feeling about the wreckage and bringing pieces up now? Do you feel like it should all be left to rest?
Well, I always did feel that way, and I guess I still do. When the ship was first found, and Dr. Ballard did expeditions down there, and he had a camera sled. And if you've ever seen the videotape where the sled just skims just a few feet above the bottom, and everything is right where it landed. There's a toilet here and a teacup there, and there's some luggage there or whatever, dishes and bottles. And it's fascinating to see where it landed. And where things landed forensically tell the story of how the ship broke apart as well. And we've lost that. That's all been brought up. And I get that people love seeing the actual items and seeing them, in museums. I don't think we've really learned much from particular items having been brought up or anything. So I was always against artifact retrieval. I do consider it a gravesite. And so, I've always been in favor of just leaving it alone, go down, take pictures. That's really all you should do. But I will go to exhibits. It's like, they said nobody wants someone's house to burn down, but you're going to watch if it's on your block kind of thing. And that's extreme. But so, I am against salvage, but I recognize that people really do appreciate being able to see these things rather than just pictures of them.
Tell us about, as a Titanic historian, enthusiast, the experience of diving and exploration, your more scientific side.
Well, I don't have a very good scientific side. I don't know chemistry, that's for sure. But I was invited out in 2001 to go on a Ghost of the Abyss expedition. And it really was exciting because we knew we were going to see things nobody alive had ever seen, going deep in the ship. And I always sort of, kind of compared it to the ship going to Skull Island to see this great monkey Kong that no one else has really seen. And because we knew we were going to see something exciting. And so, in going down to it, I was very nervous in the beginning. And, I obviously I'd never done this, never been to the bottom of the ocean. I'd never been claustrophobic. And I even said to Ed Marsh, I think it was, on the Keldysh, I've never been claustrophobic, but what happens if you get to the bottom of the ocean, you have a panic attack? And he said, well, the Russians keep a really big wrench in the thing. And he meant it, and Bill Paxton was nervous about, going down there, which made me feel a little better. And I guess he had told Gloria Stewart he'd be diving, and she went off and said, you've got young children at home. You have no business putting your life at risk and this and that, and he was kind of nervous too. And then finally the day came and, I wasn't going to say no. And so I was going down with Jim. There were two submersibles, Mir 1 and Mir 2. They're Russian submersibles.
Yeah, I was going to ask, who were you with? Who was in your submersible?
The first dive was James Cameron, and Anatoly Sigalovich was the pilot. And I got in, and I looked around, and I went, oh, okay, this is where I'm going to be for the rest of the day. And I realized what was making me nervous was just the unfamiliarity of it. And now that I'd seen it, it's like, okay, let's go. And I did make it a point not to look at the hatch cover because, in my mind, that's separating me from death. But reality is everything around you is separating you from death. And it's comforting to know that if there's even the tiniest leak, it'll implode instantly and it's all over. So there's no suffering. And I also felt very, that Jim was very competent, and I believe he was. I said afterwards that I think that if Anatoly had just suddenly dropped dead, Jim could have taken the controls and brought, the submersible back to the surface. I'm sure he could have. And so, it was fine. And, great going down there, seeing this wreck that I had studied for so long and now actually seeing the real thing. And you can only see directly out your porthole. The portholes aren't very big, and the side of the hull of the submersible, it's a 7-foot sphere. So you're really very cramped inside there, especially with a lot of extra camera equipment. And so you can only look straight out. And I kept looking at the monitors for the cameras that were outside the submersible, which Jim had developed. That was the first to have cameras outside in the water to go down there that could, pan and tilt and pivot and everything.
There, the pressure, and housing.
Exactly. They'd never had cameras that could withstand that kind of pressure before, and Jim had them developed. And so, we get down there and I keep looking at the monitors because the view is better. And I kept telling myself, Don, you have to look out the porthole. You can look at the monitors later. You can see this footage later. And so I went down twice. And on the one dive, I kept thinking about the survivors, and so-and-so stood here, and this is where so-and-so got in this lifeboat. And then on the other dive, I kept thinking about the victims. And I'd think, okay, well, this is where the band played and where the Strausses stood and this sort of thing. And my second dive was actually on 9/11. And I was in Mir 2 that day. Jim was in Mir 1, and Ken Marshall and I were in Mir 2. And so, Jim's brother, and I say radio, but there's no radio underwater. It's all done acoustically, and had sent a message kind of radioed down, and we could hear it in our submersible to Jim, which is a code that, his brother had been in military security and had a code worked out for the family, but Jim didn't have it memorized. So he had to repeat it, and he just said, there's been a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and all flights are grounded. And these two sentences didn't seem to match. What does one have to do with the other? Because we're thinking of like the terrorist attack and that bomb went off in the parking structure or something. And then we forgot about it. And that was a rescue dive. We had lost one of the robotic cameras on an earlier dive. And so our submersible was to provide lighting through the D-deck doorway into the D-deck foyer so that the other robotic camera could kind of hook it, just because we had no manipulative things that could go in that deep. And they developed a thing where they took a clothes hook and just hooked it and towed it out, which worked perfectly. So we were all excited about that. And then, when we got back to the surface, that was when they broke the news to us of what had really happened. So,
Oh, God.
On
Surreal.
9/11,
Everybody remembers where they were on 9/11, but nobody has that story.
well, there are
And
six of
the
us.
juxtaposition, but I mean, the juxtaposition, I
Yes.
mean, you're at the site of one of the greatest disasters of all time, while another of the greatest disasters of all time is happening. It's
one of the
unbelievable.
greatest of the 20th century, and so far the greatest of the 21st century.
Aye.
And it was interesting because I was told later, for what it's worth, that there were 6 people at the bottom of the ocean and 9 people in outer space, or 3 people in outer space. So, we're the 9 most remote people that day. And I mean, I could argue and say there probably was somebody out in the Sahara Desert who didn't hear about it for a week. You could argue they were more remote. But, it was an interesting place to be. It was a remarkable place to be that day. And yeah, you do remember. It's like, I always remember where I was the day Princess Diana died, because I was doing the looping, the voices over for my part in Titanic. I was up at Glen Studios in Hollywood. And
I was driving along Sunset Boulevard going to the Hollywood market, Sunday
there
market.
you were, yeah.
You can't believe what you're hearing on the radio. It was.
Well, I didn't believe it because I was in a recording studio, and suddenly somebody is playing this recording about Princess Diana being in this car accident. And I thought, well, that's not very funny, because I thought they were recording a show or something. And then finally I realized that somebody was playing a news report. And so that was where I was that day. So when I was, they're connected to the Titanic movie for me.
But not only this, I'm like, as you described that to me, I'm thinking about what it must have been like for the world when they got news of the Titanic sinking, the unsinkable ship. I mean, it's the exact same disbelief.
Yes,
the communal acceptance or non-acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, the unsinkable ship going down, this sort of thing on its maiden voyage, no less. And just it had to be just incredibly unbelievable for people that they just, assumed, well, I'm sure everyone's safe. And, there were those false reports that the ship was being towed to Halifax.
Misinformation, fake news.
Yeah, well, it was just a radio miscommunication. 2 different wireless messages got combined, and they assumed it was the Titanic being towed. And so, and everybody believed that, that was believable. It hit an iceberg, they'll just tow it to port, that sort of thing.
Even the thought that as it was sinking, that somehow it was going to right itself or survive long enough for rescue. Yeah, the constant, I don't know, maybe optimism. I don't know if optimism is the right word, or disbelief or something. Just thinking it's going to have a different outcome than what it was going to have.
They thought it would stabilize, that the water would fill up as much as it would and then stop. And, one of the things I learned on the movie set, because people kept saying they didn't realize until they were in the lifeboats how far it had sunk. And I realized that on the movie set, because when the movie set was tilted down for the sinking scenes, and you'd be walking around, after a little while, your mind would adjust to the angle and you'd sort of make it right in your head. And suddenly you'd look out and there was a highway out there that was just, parallel, it was an even highway. It wasn't on a hill or anything. And now that your mind had adjusted the ship up, that highway was at an angle. And so that's what was happening on the Titanic to people's equilibrium. As the ship was gradually sinking, they were accommodating it in their heads, and they didn't feel the list so much. And so they didn't realize how far it had sunk. And as dark as it was, if you didn't look over, the side, you couldn't really tell either. And so many people said they had no idea till they were in the lifeboats how far the ship had gone down. And now I know why, having worked on the movie, because I experienced that myself.
Having played Frederick Spedden in Titanic, having played Thomas Andrews in Ghosts of the Abyss, is there and I don't want to say character because these were real people, is there a figure from Titanic lore with whom you have a particular affinity?
I feel a connection, obviously, to the people I've met who were on board and to their families. And so, like I said, I knew this one lady, she lived in Hermosa Beach, and I knew her. And so I always, like when I watch the movie, I think about, I knew somebody who was there. And, I get a little teary-eyed at that. And I knew a lady in Santa Barbara who was only 12 years old. She was separated. Her father, fortunately, wasn't on board. And he was, again, one of those remote people because he got a telegram from New York from someone connected with him telling him that his wife and children were safe. And he didn't know what they were saved from because he was up in the mountains in India as a missionary. And it was only later he'd heard about the Titanic. So when he got this telegram dated April 18th, he thought, well, they must have been in a train wreck. That's where they were going to be on the 18th. And so, so I knew this lady up in Santa Barbara. And, I always, get choked up at the thought that, she kind of got left behind by her mother when her mother jumped into the boat where they put her smaller children. And, kind of that Sophie's choice where she had to make a decision. Do I let the small children go alone in a boat or do I stay with my 12-year-old? But she fortunately, yelled to her daughter, get in the next boat, and she did. So, they were all saved. But, I feel an affinity to the people I knew or the people whose families I really knew well. And, that's my connection, I guess you could say. And I feel that.
Yeah, there's nothing to compare with personal first person told stories. We can retell stories and rehear stories. But when you hear somebody's story for the first time, it has a really deep resonance.
It really does. And I wish more of the survivors who were willing to speak about it had been interviewed in more depth in their lifetimes, because just the few that I knew, we really learned a lot from. And so it would have been great if we'd had more.
I think a lot of it was probably post-trauma. You hear about people whose fathers fought in the First or Second World War, never spoke about their experiences, never, sat down, and at their knee, you heard all these literally war stories. They were packed away. And I can imagine that's exactly what happened to those survivor guilt, the trauma, watching the ship go down, losing a family member. It must have just been irreparable.
Well, it was. And the lady in Santa Barbara, even though she's only 12, she really didn't speak openly about it for 70 years. It took into her 80s where she finally was good about it. And the lady in Hermosa Beach, the other one, she was a good 40 years before she would talk openly about it. And, people grieve differently. People still have this attitude from the 1960s that you have to talk, your trauma out. And that's 60 years old. People got over that right away because they realize you have to get over grief the way you get over grief. And if it means you have to clam up and put it behind you and just put it in the past and not talk about it, if that's what it takes, that's what you have to do. If you have to talk about it and get it out and get it over with, then that's what you have to do. And I knew one lady whose mother and grandmother were survivors, and she said it was, they were both examples of both. This woman's mother couldn't stop talking about it in 1912. She just kept on. It was all she could talk about every day. But then her mother just put it behind her and never spoke of it again. And so they each had their own way of dealing with it to get over it.
It might be that element of the period of time, the Edwardian notion of stiff upper lip and all that kind of thing as well. Don, we think we know everything. Like there couldn't possibly be anything left to find out. We know it all by now, and that certainly was not the case last year when the Titan submersible imploded, and all of a sudden Titanic was once again, after a century, front page news again. It was right back there in the headlines. What are you still working on in terms of Titanic? Is there some quest that you have yet to fulfill?
Well, there's always some quest. There's always, things pop up every so often. For years we thought 3 dogs had survived. Now we think there might have been a 4th, and that's something, whether you can track that down or not, I'm not sure. We still try to figure out who left in which lifeboat. There are still people out there. We don't know whatever happened to them. There are, a handful of maybe 10 people. They got off the Carpathia and eventually disappeared. And obviously somebody knows what happened to them, but they maybe had a very common name. Again, never spoke about it. So it just kind of, maybe didn't have a lot of family. And so there's just, there's different avenues to still pursue. You can kind of, pick a topic every so often and just really dig into it. But, as the years go by, there's more and more, especially since the movie. There are so many experts out there, and people who think they're experts, but people actually do, knuckle down and maybe will pick one topic. And for example, they'll pick maybe just one of the officers and devote their time to just completely researching that person or something. And then other people will study the breakup of the ship, or, somebody will study how it was constructed, what was
number of rivets, the rivet heads, the rivet nerds.
Well, there are rivet counters, that's for sure. And it's a good thing there are, because, when they were building the set, they wanted the rivets right. And, that's one of the things. My friend Tom was a model maker. And, when he was working on it, he said, well, I can do that. He said, I know how many rivets per, plate. And we just multiply by the number of plate. I mean, loosely, I'm doing this very loosely, but he was able to help them figure out, very accurately, how many rivets on each plate or whatever. And so there are rivet counters. And I always joke that Ken Marshall can tell you the perimeter of every porthole on board. And maybe he can, I don't know. But, that's my example.
I don't think anybody's going to argue with him either. So he can.
Oh, I'm not going to. No, but that's my example of how well he knows the ship. And so there are people, all different types of experts now in all different areas.
What's the question you get asked most often, wherever you go, in all of your travels, and all of your, because you have a diverse place in lots of avenues of Titanic history. What's the most common reaction you get?
Well, I think you've asked it already. It's basically, how did you get interested in this? That's the one that everybody wants to know.
Origin story.
It seems like you can talk about the whole Titanic disaster, but people want to know one little detail about Don Lynch, and that seems pretty insignificant compared to the sinking of the Titanic.
But it's something we all have in common. We all have our own Titanic origin story. So
Yes.
that's the great common denominator.
That's true. That's right.
And when you spoke with us previously, you were at the Queen Mary for the anniversary
Yes.
commemoration, and you were part of a Titanic book event there. Tell
The
us about your
Titanic
books,
book club.
so that we
Yes.
can jump on Amazon and fill our shopping cart if we're missing any volumes.
Well, my gosh, there's, so many. I think they said that after the Titanic.
Yours. We want to know about yours.
Well, mine, Titanic and Illustrated History, obviously, and then Titanic, Ghosts of the Abyss, the companion piece to the documentary. Those are the two Titanic books. And then there's a new book out now, coming out soon. God, I was one of the contributors to it. It's a collection of artifacts related to the Titanic, not necessarily things that were taken off the ship, but also things peripherally. And there's going to be a volume 2 coming out next year, and maybe later this year.
No, you have a permanent ticket to our ship here.
Well, thank
and
you.
You are always welcome to come back and talk about whatever you want to talk about, because to anyone with even a passing interest in Titanic, you're the man.
Well, thank
Yes.
you. I appreciate that. It's very
Thank you
kind.
so much, Don, for coming. It was one of the best and most enjoyable talks, Titanic talks.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've had fun. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
You're in our clutches now. Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. We've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop. And Nelson has a new book out. Dancing Between the Raindrops is a steamy page-turner full of all the tales Nelson can still remember from New York City in the 1980s. It's a coming-of-age story about friends in the era of big hair, padded shoulders, and punk rock. Dancing Between the Raindrops is available on Amazon, or ask for it at your local bookstore.